He was one of the creators of the MLS. He sat on the World Cup committees. He chaired with programming on how the 94 World Cup would come in and the 99 Women's World Cup, where I think everybody will remember that moment when the penalty shootout, when they beat China. So that was, an incredible feat. And dare I say it, I know it was the second time, I believe it was the second time that the women won the Women's World Cup, but dare I say it was almost like a defining moment for women's soccer. I mean, you can still remember the celebrations. They rip off the jersey and they're running over for all together after winning the shootout. Those kind of things are iconic, and they are what kick on things. So what I wanted to do was welcome the godfather of football in America, in my opinion, Alan Rothenberg. Alan, how are you, sir?
I'm great. Thank you very much. And you're one of the few people that remember that there was a prior World Cup. They didn't even call it that. When they started the first Women's World Cup in 1991, they stuck it as far away in China as they could. I think it was in Guangzhou. And they didn't even call it at that time a World Cup. Later they gave it that name, but it doesn't matter because the United States won that one. And obviously it's going on since then to be the dominant force in women's soccer or football, as you say.
Yeah, they have been. I mean, and it's an interesting story. Alan and I, we caught up yesterday in preparation for this. And when I was growing up in Ireland playing football myself, we used to look at the US and the success. I won't refer to the 1930s success because I can't remember that one. But certainly in 2002, when they got to the quarterfinals in South Korea and they were edged by Germany, I mean, they had an awful strong team, and it looked, the MLS was kicking off, and it looked like the trajectory was going in that direction. And it was kind of obvious that that the US within 20 years would be a powerhouse. Now, that hasn't exactly materialized, but the plans on which it was embedded were really solid, and you were one of the key architects in that. And I think it's coming up to a pivotal point now with the World Cup being here again in 26. Love to know your thoughts on that, Alan, and where the plans were when you were in the hot zone when this was all kicking off.
Well, when it was all kicking off, everything was a hot zone. I remember at that time, and to a certain extent, you may be alluding to it again, everybody said that soccer is the sport of the future in the United States, obviously. And they kept saying it's around the corner, but the block kept getting longer and longer till we could get around the corner. Probably the challenge that the United States on the men's side have in becoming that competitive force you're talking about is the dispersion of our talent. Almost every other major country has a national headquarters, and they get their teams together, or they have an academy. And if not the national association, the major clubs have that. And so the development of talent is pretty much concentrated. The local grassroots explosion of soccer in the United States obviously has been terrific. And from a marketer standpoint, it's great because there's so many new people that are prospective consumers, and you can't beat that. On the other hand, it's so concentrated in local state associations or local clubs, and you frankly need much more concentration. The United States Soccer Federation made an attempt to have a national academy, but they've now abandoned that. To me, the future is going to be MLS clubs with their academies, because in those cases, economics to the player, to the families that have a son or daughter, are going to be non-existent, because the clubs just want to develop the best talent they can, and they aren't trying to make money directly on the academy, which is contrary to the local clubs who want to make sure that anybody that participates pays. They may have a scholarship here and there, but by and large, it's a pay to play program, and that obviously leaves out a huge segment of society. And in fact, with few exceptions, most sports are dominated by athletes who come from the lower classes, from the poorer communities. And so by doing the pay to play, we really are leaving out that group of people, and they're vital to the growth of the sport in this country. The other part that's a challenge is that, and we talked about this yesterday, if you look on the men's side, for sure, the dominant teams recently in World Cups have been what? Germany, Spain. Guess what? In Germany, 8 out of, I think, of their starters came through the Bayern Munich system. So they were familiar with each other. They had played years and years and years, the same style, and individually they knew each other's instincts. In Spain, it was almost all from either Real Madrid or Barcelona. And again, you had basically 5 or 6 players who grew up together and were cohesive. And actually they played similar styles, so it was easy. The problem we have right now in the United States is that our talent is dispersed. Some are playing on MLS teams, some are playing abroad, but they're not concentrated in one area. And so when we have a competition, they're brought together for a few weeks, and it's an all-star team, but they haven't played together. People forget, in 1994, when we surprised everybody by making it to the quarterfinals and only got eliminated by the ultimate champion Brazil in a very tight 1-0 game, that team had played together for 18 months because at that time, foreign teams were not accepting United States talent. I think we had one player who had a 3rd division opportunity in Germany and one in a 1st division team in Mexico. Other than that, we couldn't get anybody to play abroad. So we set up a resident camp, and for 18 months, that group played together, and therefore we overperformed. The core of that group also carried forward when you talked about 2002. We were a horrible disappointment in '98, but by 2002, again, the core group, they knew each other. They had played together. Now it's the difficulty is what I described. But anyway, back to the final part of that is that I think the MLS academies are going to be the answer, and we'll get there. It may not, I don't know if it's 20 years, but we'll get there.
Now, I mean,
right now we got a lot of talent, maybe the best pool of talents I've seen in my whole time. They're dispersed. We got to see when we pull them together for these competitions right now to qualify and then ultimately to play in the World Cup, whether they come together. And if so, I think we'll surprise people.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you in that I last night paid $4,500 for my son to play football next year at 12 years old. Now, I tell my mates in Ireland this, and one of them is a director of an academy, one of the bigger academies. They charge €50 for 6 months. Just thinking to myself, where in God's name does this work? Because when you look at the Messis and Pele, they come from Falavelas. They did not grow up paying $5,000 for this or that. Messi wasn't even able to afford medicine for his growth challenges. So, I mean, I could not agree with you more that it's kind of, and that for me has always been the reasoning when I've been in this country trying to figure out why are you not in the semi-final? Why are you not competing with Germany, Spain, Italy? Because you should be, because you do have the talent and you have, enough, you have the mass. So it should be the same as the Olympics type thing. So I think it's a super interesting concept that you're talking about with the MLS academies. I mean, it falls into, especially when we're talking about the women's game, and only today, as was mentioned earlier, MasterCard signing up with the NWSL, and you see the growth of that and how it's almost mirroring the MLS. When you started, there were so many teams, and you had to have it as it's a closed league, which is, we'll get to that in a little bit because that's going to be a conversation, especially with the Super League. But the reality that, you know, you had to build it, you had to program it, you had to make sure that cities were behind it and that it grew and you gave it room to grow. But with the NWSL, they're in a great position where they're on the back of, as you say, amazing success in the national team women's. But what's going to be interesting, going to your point about players being dragged away, is that in Europe, UEFA have now upped the ante and put $24 million on an annual budget into their European competition. You see the Women's Super League in both in England and in Spain putting serious money behind their teams. Now, the gulf in the difference between the top teams and some of those lower level teams in the top leagues in England seems to be pretty stark. Like Chelsea, I think, won their last game 7-0 or 7-1, Chelsea women's team, to win the league. But themselves, Man City, they're taking the best players up from here, like Rose Lavelle, who I just think she's one of the best players I've ever seen. She's just an awesome player. They're going over there. And I'm wondering, what will that do? And I'm thinking about it from a brand perspective, because obviously it's going to affect the league. But from a brand perspective, when we get involved in football over here, but because people follow players now, and our players, you know, is it that our best players are going to go where the money is and go to those bigger leagues? And as a result, we might not be well invested? Or, you know, I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
I'm happy to share them. I think we also should be talking to Lisa later about the challenge.
I want to put her on the spot.
In some ways, what I described for the men, this is the absolute opposite. You know, the United States got a head start on the rest of the world, primarily, frankly, due to Title IX in women's sports. And so we started at the top. And really, when you look at the early years, it was the United States, the Nordic countries, and Germany. Quickly, Japan and China jumped on board, and then shortly thereafter, Brazil. But so many of the traditional soccer powers, particularly in the Mediterranean countries, the South American countries, their cultures did not advance women's equality. And so we started on top, we're still on top. But now, as you indicated, the rest of the world is saying, hey, we want to get on board, we want to do this. And some of those clubs have enormous funds. And therefore, just as MLS has the difficulty of keeping their best players because the wealthy European clubs offer them too much for them to resist, I think the challenge to the NWSL will be a comparable one, that, okay, now we've done so well and we have great players and we're in terrific shape, but those players, how can you ask them to turn down really, really lucrative salaries just out of loyalty to their current club or to the country? And so it's all good, but the challenge is, as they say, just the opposite of what it is for the MLS.
You were one of the main organizers around the World Cup here in '94. I mean, I'm sure there's a good deal of reminiscence when you see the 26 coming around here. What advice would you have for brands, not only leading up in terms of time and how they should do and what they should do, but also in terms of legacy, so that we understand that it's not just a 1 month event, but that this has real opportunity for brands to program, own a positioning, be super relevant, especially in today's society where if you're not relevant, you're nothing. What would you say to brands who are looking at this, the World Cup, and 26 coming around the corner?
You mentioned at the beginning the growth of soccer. It's going to continue. For a brand to look at it as a one-off is the loss of an opportunity. And in some ways, they're foolish to buy a World Cup sponsorship if it's just, okay, we're going to take advantage of the big TV audience in 26, but that's it. What they need to have is a relationship. And obviously, today, as you know better than I do even, brands are more interested in connecting with their consumers than they are just getting their name known. And so the beauty also of something like the World Cup is you've got many years to build up. So if you commit now to the sponsorship for 26 and beyond, if that's possible, you can develop a long-term program that not only gives you the benefit of the exposure at the event, but a day-to-day relationship with your consumers as you build up to the event and then thereafter. And so I think that's what's unique about the World Cup, whether it's men's or women's, is the opportunity to kind of highlight and have the apex of your program. But you got to get into it early. You know, you're going to want to come up with programs for hospitality. Obviously, that's another reason to do it in advance. So many of the brands want to do it to talk to their consumers or talk to their vendors or suppliers, whoever's most important to them, and they want to have hospitality programs where you can't wait until a few months before the event to decide, okay, I'm going to do a hospitality program because the best venues have already been picked off and exploited by your competitors. And so you're going to have a second-rate hospitality program. So planning in advance and then sticking with it and building as you go. I mean, again, it would be foolish, I think, for a brand to just buy the World Cup without at the same time talking to the NWSL or in MLS and the U.S. national teams about some kind of sponsorship so that they own the sport, if you will, rather than just cherry pick one piece or another. Now, they might, there are certain endemic brands, particularly to women's soccer, that they might want to overspend there. But the fact of the matter is, the more they promote the sport at all levels, the more benefit they're going to get.
It's interesting, and it's going back to the point we brought up earlier, especially with the NWSL and women's soccer in general. But when you look at the evolution of sport, and not just soccer here, but in general, and brands being involved in it, I mean, you would have kicked off with field boards, and then we would have been, and even with the NBA, it's only recent where you have patch on the jersey, on the front of the jersey, or
I will put a plug in for MLS because we were the first American sport. I'm leaving NASCAR out of it. American team sport that sold jersey kits.
And it makes complete sense.
From the start. I mean, my current partner at Premier Partnerships, Randy Bernstein, who is head of the revenue operations for MLS, went around and sold those naming rights.
And before your time. So the reality is, for me, is the evolution of this, and now it's gone into media and OTT, and how you can use social, and as we talked about with individual players, but it's almost transforming now into, and you see it even in the recent partnerships that were announced, and again, not just in soccer, but people take societal points. Women's soccer stands for so much more. It almost transcends sport, as men's take certain points on, especially when you see in England about them taking a knee over racism, or you see people like Marcus Rashford talking about feeding people who in need, especially young kids. Women's society about our women's social activations, and you see players and administrators going to Congress and speaking to the president about equality, diversity. So the reality is that brands seem to be needing to do much more than just sponsor, that they have to take positions in society. The question I have for you, Alan, is when is it right for a brand to go that, and how far should they go? So because they're a brand, they're not an NGO, so they have to be, wide enough to speak to all people and not take specific stance that alienate other people, but be true to their brand. It's a tight question sometimes. How much should they leverage brands to do that? How should they go about it?
I think I would throw that question back to you because it's the brand that has the challenge. But I think what's happened is over the last several years, and it is really peaking now, the power of athletes has changed dramatically. They probably always had it, but they never used it because the culture was stay out of societal issues, just play your games, and to the extent that you want to exploit it commercially, fine, get your sponsorships and endorsements, but don't comment on social activities. That's changed so dramatically. There were so many things. I mean, you can go right here in Los Angeles. The players revolting against Donald Sterling caused the NBA to force the sale of the LA Clippers. Obviously, the position that the women have been taking in soccer, particularly, has heightened the discussion with respect to equality, and almost daily there seems to be some dispute, but the players' activity has forced companies to be in a position where they have to decide whether they get involved in a public issue or not. It's not easy for a CEO today, I don't think, because as you mentioned, you're going to have people alienated by positions. I mean, and there's one great example of the change. Think about how the NFL reacted to Kaepernick. Personally, I mean, it was disgraceful, but it doesn't matter. They basically shunned him and did not get behind the issue that he was trying to bring to everybody's attention. And then as of this summer, suddenly, while they haven't given Kaepernick an opportunity to play football again, they certainly have changed their position vis-a-vis the athletes. The NBA's probably always been way out in front of all the sports in terms of being with the social causes of the time. Because again, probably earlier than most sports, it was player dominated, and it was particularly obviously player dominated by Black athletes who have a particular cause to carry. And now, obviously, you're seeing the pressure being put on corporations because of some of the voting laws that are going on around the country. Those are probably more corporate driven, but most of the other ones that I'm talking about, God bless the athletes for stepping up and being heard. I think on July 1st, you're going to see the NCAA suddenly allow licensing for athletes. Been a long time coming, and I think a lot of people have thought, the NCAA restrictions were tremendously unfair, but it wasn't until athletes started to speak up. I mean, go back a few years where the Northwestern players unionized. I mean, that was unheard of. And so I think, as I said before, the challenge is less on us who are out there. It's more on the companies and the brands, whether they want to step forward, take positions. And if they do, they have to understand who they're alienating and who they're not.
I think that's a fair point. Speaking of player power versus club power, as a European, I'd be remiss not to bring this conversation up with you. We've seen recently about the Super League in Europe and what has happened around that. And for me, obviously, we're all going to have our opinion about whether we thought it was right or wrong or how they went about it or whether it was tone deaf. But you and I had an interesting point in that you and I both have contacts in this world and of football, who obviously have much more bigger Rolodex than mine. But this Super League didn't suddenly just appear. This has been around, this conversation has been around for years. And I don't think it's going to go away anytime. I don't think that it's going to go away as soon suddenly as it has appeared, to be truthful about it. But what is interesting for me is the effect it's going to have on the States, in that the US has always carried on very nicely. In the MLS, when you started it, it was, FIFA almost allowed it to develop so program. But there's always been that question mark over the fact that you're a closed league versus what it is everywhere else and under the FIFA mandates where it has to be a pyramid system. That Super League, I think, may, and this is just my personal opinion, may bring that conversation up again, whereby, especially when you take into consideration that a lot of the owners of these teams in question are American, and they are used to this closed league and commercializing it. Whereas you saw the reaction across Europe by fans that this was just like not comprehensible. It was completely against the fabric of the game. Whereas it is the fabric of the game here because it's similar to the NFL model, an NBA model, NHL model, you name it. But do you think that this may be the start of that wider conversation? Because when you were there, obviously the MLS had a different perspective. It was starting. But now it's a bit of a giant. I mean, they're doing well and they're on the trajectory this way, as are the NWSL. But how long would you get away with a closed league with inside football?
Well, I think, again, from the United States standpoint, we've only done it that way in all sports. And so I don't think there's going to be a lot of pressure internally to change anything. Especially in Europe, the tradition has been there for the longest time. I'm not so sure if they were going to start new leagues today, they would be ones where there was promotion and relegation. Frankly, the whole structure grew up from the grassroots up. There were clubs. I mean, people talk about football club, FC, but they really were clubs, and some of them still exist. So they weren't formed as for-profit operations. They were local. They were fan-driven.
Community centers.
And even though today you have big investors buying some of the major clubs, the core and the tradition is still classic clubs. It's the fans. It's for the fans. And if you were trying to get new investors in a different structure, I'm not sure how it would work. I know when we went around to get people, it was hard enough to get them to invest in the first place in Major League Soccer. But if we went to the investors in New York or in Los Angeles or in Chicago, in the major markets, and said, we want you to invest X dollars to be in this league. And they looked at it and said, wait a minute, some guy right down the block with a little local team spending next to nothing can knock me out. Would they invest? Number one. Number two, TV's looking at it now. Things are dispersed more today than they were then. But the fact of the matter is, if you would lose a club from the first division in a major market, TV and brands, therefore, would be really concerned that they're going to lose half of their potential audience. And so it's totally different. It's the way they started, which is different. And the way we started is different. Now, talk about a super league. First of all, it exists already in Europe. What's the Champions League? I mean, it's a different kind of competition. It's not week in and week out for the standings, but it's a super league, for crying out loud.
I'll debate that one with you. I mean, Liverpool are 50-50 if they're going to make it. It's going to go on to the last. The point is you have to qualify for that.
Yes, but the pre-qualification is within your league.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You can't get invited into it the way this potential super league was going to be.
And again, even the Premier League. Well, there's two leagues there. I mean, yes, every once in a while you can see a Leicester City surprise everybody.
Yeah. It's once in 100 years.
Super clubs and the rest.
Yeah.
So it's, I'm not saying it's never going to change. Probably inevitably something changes because it always does. But right now, the forces of UEFA, the forces of FIFA are so dead set against changing what they have that, and there's so much, again, country by country, there's a lot of government. US is different. Other countries, the government has a lot to say on subjects like this.
Yes.
So it's a different world. I agree with you. FIFA bent over backwards to help MLS at the beginning. They looked the other way with respect to our closed league, as you call it. They looked the other way because at the beginning, you'll recall, we had individuals who owned more than one team. And we set up great rules to make sure that there were no shenanigans, but at least on paper, it certainly was something that concerned everybody. Again, FIFA looked the other way.
Yeah.
They wanted us to play, and it would be in some ways great if we did the same calendar as the rest of the world. But again, from a practical standpoint, we we've got a lot of northern cities that are important to us that have more than occasional brutal winters where it would really have an adverse effect. And also in terms of finding at that time the slot in the 12-month calendar where soccer would have the best chance and not have to go head to head right in the heart of the NFL season, the NBA season, college football season. And also, by the way, before we had soccer-specific stadiums, which have been fabulous and so crucial to the success of MLS, we had to play in NFL or college-owned stadiums, and so we didn't control the dates. And so there's a lot of practical reasons why we could play at a different schedule. But again, FIFA had to look the other way.
You can bet your bottom dollar, Alan, that FIFA know full well that in order for this game to grow, you need America involved. You need America being successful. You need America to be at the forefront of competition in this. It just generates so much more commercial.
That's why they granted us the rights in '94. It wasn't for any other reason other than, okay, we got to exploit the most powerful and the richest country in the world.
Of course. And I'm sure Lisa will be hoping to use those arguments and see the Women's World Cup return here in 27.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to leave you on the, this has been brilliant, and it's been an honor and a pleasure speaking to you, sir. Obviously, you know, as I introduced you as the godfather of sport in this country, I mean it sincerely that, you know, you have an amazing legacy that you've built in here. Knowing that you were one of the architects of MLS, I'd love to leave with your parting thoughts on what advice we would have for the NWSL, or how you could see, because they seem to be mirroring what you set up with the MLS and how they were progressing. What pitfalls, what either for the NWSL or for brands that are because there are so many. I know I said, Lisa, I'm sure she'll talk about the announcement about MasterCard, which occurred today. Herself and Mitch Pohl would have put together, but also with regards to, you know, they've done with Ally and Nationwide. They've done a lot of announcements recently, and they're really going this way, and investors and so on. What words of advice would you have for them or for brands in terms of programming over the next few years?
Well, I think that they should look at assume 27, we get the World Cup in the United States, and I sure hope we can, and I think FIFA would be smart to do it. That's going to do for the women's game, and for the NWSL in particular, what 94 did for the men's game. Now, they've got a head start because in 94 we didn't have the Pro League, but the fact of the matter is we used the showcase of 94 to bring more sponsors in, bring networks in, obviously expose it so much to the general public who didn't have the awareness. I think you're going to see the same thing, assuming that they grant the rights to the Women's World Cup to the United States in 27. There's going to be a build-up toward that. There are going to be more brands signing on in anticipation of that. And with the expectation that following 27, the dramatic but sort of steady growth of the NWSL will explode. That I have no doubt. Look, if we could sell out major stadiums throughout the United States in 1999, we're going to have major stadiums with more people watching the fan festival outside because they couldn't get inside. In 27, and so there will be just a massive explosion. And I also look at the opportunity for the legacy of 26 on the men's side. You know, if I got a couple more minutes, I don't want to steal Lisa's time, but you know, with the legacy from the '94 World Cup, we created the United States Soccer Foundation. The United States Soccer Foundation recently has been devoting virtually all of its efforts and all of its programming to underserved communities. And back to what I said before about where the athletes come from, if there's one thing that's been lacking in the United States is a huge influx of kids from lower class neighborhoods. And by the way, unfortunately, they tend to be disproportionately people of color, Hispanics and Blacks in large measure. And I think that the foundation is working with the various bid cities to host the 26 World Cup, to set up programs to satisfy FIFA's demand for a legacy program. Well, I can't think of a better legacy for 26 than to really open up the opportunities for players in underserved areas to play big time soccer. Obviously, again, there are going to be huge financial improvements and hopefully a national team headquarters instead of a traveling show. And you know, now that we're filling up soccer specific stadiums, maybe even larger soccer specific stadiums for the MLS. So it'll be nothing but good. But back to the women, I think it'll be a huge second launching or third launching pad, if you will, for NWSL.
Well, that's a brilliant segue into our next guest. But Alan, thank you very much, sir. It was an honor speaking to you, and I hope we can meet again sometime, maybe over a coffee this time.
Or over a yogurt.
Yogurt. Thank you. Our next guest is going to be Lisa Baird, who is the commissioner of the NWSL, but has a long tradition and presence inside sport. Lisa obviously worked with the Olympic Committee for a number of years, and I have the distinct pleasure of saying and shouting for her as a fellow Connecticut resident. She is going to be one of the nominees for the Executive of the Year for the Sports Business Journal, where she